Hello and welcome to Inverted Orthodoxy podcast. I'm Kyle, here with Doug and potentially Blake.
It's like the Schrodinger's cat thing again.
Totally. Blake said that especially if you're only listening to the audio version, Blake may or may not be here. He may be dead or alive. We are unsure until his voice appears on the podcast. No, Blake's awaiting a phone call, and so we're kicking off without him. We are hoping to be able to have him join us, but for now, you got the two of us, so nobody will be here to warm the fence. But
That's right.
just the two of us as we kick off. So we're going to kick off with some AER. Time for accusations, explanations, and recantations. Following the conversation last week about lust, is lust always sexual? And what is the difference between lust and coveting? For example, I've often watched home makeover shows and felt stuck financially as we couldn't do renos or to afford to move. But I have spent lots of time looking at houses wishing we could move, imagining my dream house and how I would decorate it. This is not just looking at houses and thinking it is beautiful. The eye is fixed on focus on imagining a life there. Is this lust?
Absolutely, it can be. This is kind of the topic of the hour because we had this question on the podcast last week, and then I spoke on it in our 7 Deadly Sins
And here we are
on the
again.
weekend, and here we are again. Clearly,
We can't escape lust.
you're not wrong. If you look at the definition of lust, it includes both of those in any dictionary definition of lust. It talks about like the let me pull up. I pulled up Merriam-Webster. Usually intense or unbridled sexual desire is definition 1. Number 2, an intense longing. And so it can be either one of them. And as I was doing some work preparing for my sermon, I really felt like you could go either way. And certainly there is an overlap. Often we equate lust to sex. Yeah. And so that's kind of where I went in my sermon, and that's where the person who asked the question last week was. But if you look at, I want to say it's 1 John 2, 12 to 14-ish, somewhere in there. He talks about the lust of the eyes and the lust of the flesh.
Right.
2 different kinds of lust. Right. And I absolutely believe that this is accurate, that lust is not just sexual. And I base that, so funny story, I was going to actually potentially work this into my message on the weekend, but a sermon is very much the act of figuring out which parts of all of the things you've accumulated need to be said and which don't. And this ended up not making it into my sermon just for the sake of time and fitting in with what I felt like needed to be shared. A number of years ago, we as a staff did the Enneagram. And
which may posit more questions already, just stating that.
Sure.
There's controversy there.
And there is some controversy there. We've addressed this at one point on the podcast. You and I both appreciate the Enneagram in its true form, but also feel like for the majority of people who talk about the Enneagram, they really miss the heart of it.
Yes.
Because the Enneagram is often presented as, find out your number, and then whatever your number
Justify
is,
all those behaviors for the rest of your life because of them.
Exactly. Or use that number as a reason to tell other people how they need to interact with you or how they need to talk with you. So it very much becomes either behavior justification or relationship management. Well, I'm a 6, and so you have to do this, and you have to talk to me this way. Welcome, Blake. It's great to have you here. So
thanks for having me.
You were only potentially here before. Now you're actually here.
Nice.
It's good to know you're not dead. So you missed that part of the conversation.
Enneagram, sorry.
Enneagram,
we love it for its true form, and then I think that was leading towards your number and how that.
Yes, and so when you have the different numbers, if you actually dig into what it's really all about, your number reveals a root sin, which is a thing that is probably the issue you're going to struggle with more than any other area of your life naturally, like a default wrong setting in your soul. And for mine, when we did it, I ended up being a number 8, which is the challenger, and the root sin was lust. And that was really convicting. And it went into, this is not just about sex, but it's about a constant desire for more. And that I really was challenged by that. for a couple of reasons. Number one was I was like, when you look at them, I would probably had the one that, you know, most Christians would frown upon. Right. And just also it was like, and it was really this moment of, it brought about a lot of introspection in my life about how I lived, and that I had lived with this constant desire for more, and that really shaped and drove a lot of my life from the shadows. And so for me, it was really this moment of opening my eyes to see that lust, although not just sexual, had driven me in a lot of my actions for a lot of my life, and that if I wanted to move past that, I needed to repent and turn from that and intentionally develop gratitude and contentment and practice these things. And so since we did that, that's something I've really been working on in my own soul, because I recognized from that lust was not just sexual.
Jumping in? All right.
Well, I know what the question is, but I was going to just talk more about the Enneagram, because that was a day when we did that as a staff that I did not expect. Like, I'd done other personality tests before, and they're fun, and they're like, "Oh, I'm a whatever," and and then they went into this root sin
comes in
thing.
as a hammer.
And I was like, "What is this? Like, this is awful." Mine was pride, and it was like so bad. Like, I also, Doug, have done a lot of work in the last few years since that time. Going,
and most of the time you do those personality tests, and it's like, hey, look, I'm a this. And I've always like been the challenger or the type A or the whatever it is. And it's always like, yeah, that's cool. I'm the best one. Because I think any type A person thinks they're the best.
Whoever named type A people type A instead of B really just wanted to inflate that ego. Because if you had called them type B, there'd be a lot of people who are not so excited to be a type B person.
But if they'd have named it type B, the type A people would have just changed the name.
Yeah, they'd be mad. They're like, no, we're A.
Exactly. And I used to like, when you did personality tests, joke around that like I got the winning one. Right. And so when they turned it on its head that day,
an Enneagram,
and made it about this root sin, it was very humbling.
Yeah, yes, totally.
So, Kyle, you want to disclose your root sin?
I can't rember how
sure
it was.
You can.
I always
wasn't that bad at all.
I believe it was three to winged to 4.
You were at number 3?
Yeah, I can't remember.
Well, you know what? Just
all of it.
You talk all about it.
And I really struggled between 8 and 3, figuring it out because of just some different things. And it came down to the underlying motivation.
Right.
I'm just going to Google Enneagram 3 root sin. So, untruth or deceit.
There you go.
Oh, he's a liar.
Yeah, and I've been doing it all this time on the podcast.
If you think about it, he just told us he didn't remember. Right. Did you really not remember, Kyle?
I always, because I've said a couple times that I'm a 4 now that I'm a 3. I've said I'm a 4, and people go, "Oh, really? That's like the super personal, like care for people. You're probably a 4. My wife's a 4." But I mix up the numbers, so I'm just very cautious to say it because I've been in that situation where people are like, "You're not a 4." So. That's all.
So number 3 is they create an image that looks good, can be sold, and finally will win.
There you go.
So
there you go.
Yeah. So I just didn't want to mix up because I have forgotten a few times which one it is.
Back to your
question,
thoughts on the question.
Yes, there we are. I think this one largely comes down to semantics. Absolutely, the whole idea of defining lust there is really helpful. Depending on which part of the scripture you go to, you're going to have distinctions needed to be made about it. I'm thinking specifically the end of the 10 Commandments. Don't covet your neighbor's things, as well as don't covet your neighbor's wife, are separated there to try to make some distinction. We've got language of covet there to cover both, whereas in other spots we've got lust and greed countering from one another. And so I think we all can understand the concept, and if you especially the weight of the word lust in some ways hits harder, like, yeah, we're all a little greedy, we're okay to say that. You all of a sudden offend people a little bit more, and we all struggle with lust, and I'm sure you saw that in people's eyes Sunday preaching. We're all of a sudden like, well maybe not. So for me, sometimes using language that becomes more weighty can be helpful. So to say, oh man, I'm lusting when I look at those houses, that will become more convicting for me to deal with that issue, versus other times it may become without that background information or without that willingness to have the deeper conversation that could become confusing language, and coveting may be more universally understood. The same tension we feel with Catholic versus universal church and the creeds, as we've discussed a few times here. So I would tend to lean towards describing your feelings towards homes or anything like that as covetous versus lustful. But again, I will completely agree, it's just semantics.
I think there's a difference, though, in that coveting, if you look in the Ten Commandments, there's a relational aspect to it. Do not covet your neighbors, and then fill in the blank.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
So let's say that, I'm looking at your car.
Yeah.
And I'm like, man, I really like Kyle's car, and I
Yeah.
wish I had a car like that. That's coveting.
Right.
But I could just lust for a new car. I could lust for a Ferrari.
But the third word that I guess you could play into this whole mix, though, is greed, right? So I could be greedy for those things there, and without the relational component that I still think fulfills the end. I don't think there's any wrong with, in most cases, substituting all these words for one another.
Yeah.
But I would just say, even if you play greed in, it doesn't have to be the relational end too.
Yeah, but I guess I'm just saying that to me, because you're equating those two, and I do think there's an overlap, sure. But I think one of the differences would be coveting to me seems like it's more of a relational.
Okay.
There'd be an
That's
element
fair.
of relational.
I haven't thought of that
right?
end of
Because I
things.
don't think I would covet something like, how do I covet somebody who has a beautiful house in
the home reno show right here in the example? Is that coveting?
And maybe it is because you're aware of it.
Yeah.
Like, you have to know what you're. There has to be some knowledge of what you're coveting.
Right.
I guess would be the thing. Whereas you could lust for something completely imaginary.
Right. Yeah.
Right?
Is there, I don't know if you guys talked about this, like just as you're talking about the semantics here, like the Ten Commandments, like lust, and even the way Jesus uses it in the passage you described on Sunday, is like for a person.
Yep.
Whereas coveting would be things. Is there a difference between a
Well, that's what we
person and a
started
thing?
before you
talked
were
about
able to
that?
join
Okay.
us. That
Sorry.
Yep.
you can use that term lust in either context.
Right.
Yeah, and even when I looked it up in another dictionary, same thing. It primarily sexual is its first understanding, and then secondary was greed as well. So it was able to substitute in. So
And I think if you don't qualify the word lust, most people think about sex.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That person is really struggling with lust. But if you qualify lust, then I think you can redirect it. And so I think default is towards sex.
Yeah.
But if you said to somebody, that person has real lust for power,
yeah,
you would be
you
like,
get it.
oh, okay, I
Yeah.
know what their lust is directed at, and it's not sex.
yeah.
Yeah.
And
Right?
it's just the failings of linguistics here, in the same way where we have the opposite side of the problem with our language around love within English, and then you jump to other languages like Greek that has 4 or 5 different options for that, versus here it seems we've got a plethora of options to describe this feeling of I want that, and it can be with people or things depending on your context, but I think lust very much can fluctuate in its usage.
Yeah. English is very much a language with some oxymoronic things and some just weird things.
Yes.
We use the same word to describe an intense liking as a lifelong commitment.
Yeah, totally.
Which is just so like, wow, that's a wide range that we use that word, and without even thinking.
Yeah. But I would also encourage the person, there's ways to still have these, because I know sometimes my own tendencies will, I guess I can't watch those shows anymore, or I can't have these conversations about our dream home, or think about my dream home and how to decorate it. We had a conversation as a family for probably an hour and a half the other day. Like, can you imagine if we won the lottery? What would we build? What would be in your bedroom? What would be in your bedroom? What would we have? Like, you can have fun with those. I don't think they have to be avoided. It's dealing with that heart matter
I'm
towards
going to
it.
disagree with you there. I think that if you recognize this is an area that you struggle, you probably should avoid it.
That's just they can deal with those things and still be able to have those conversations.
I think that we all have areas of our life that we need to just say no to. Like, in the same way that the alcoholic needs to say no to alcohol. Right? There are some people who can just have a drink and it's not an issue. There's some people who can't. And they recognize this is an area of weakness. And maybe this is one of those areas where, for this person, and I'm not saying it is, they got to discern that for themselves.
Yeah.
But I do think there are times, and I think in every one of our lives, there are areas that we go, I need to stay away from that, and I need to put a fence around that thing.
Yeah.
Because I can't stay in the shallow end of the pool in it.
Yeah.
Right?
This just
I think
sorry.
I was going to say with that, I'll walk the fence between you guys.
Really? What a shocker. Kyle actually mentioned that
like,
in the
till
intro
Blake
when
gets
you
here,
were
there's nobody here to warm the fence.
Okay. I would agree with you, Doug. Like, there's things we need to say no to, but that's not your conviction. Like, each person needs to decide what 100%. They're convicted of. I know when I'm convicted, right? Like, I've watched something or seen something or done something and been like, that was not okay.
Yeah.
Right? Then I need to be aware. But at the same time, just cutting things off because I'm convicted of doesn't necessarily deal with the root that is going on, right? So if you have the ability and the self-reflection and the time, then I'd be with Kyle. Like, you might be able to go after the roots of this and go, and my coveting becomes because I, whatever, fill in the blanks. Like, it could be anything. But we really encourage people in soul care, even with our inner healing prayer we do in this church, to go after your roots, because I think that's where you get healed. And then maybe you can watch these shows, no problem after that, because you're like, I get it. This is the deal. It's not the house. It's the whatever. So how's that for fence walking?
I like it. There's certain things so I read a book beginning of last year on binge eating. And I definitely have used that term towards certain patterns in my life and ways I've consumed and abused food. It was really fascinating because the guy had written other books around other addictions like alcohol and smoking and stuff like that. And he had a serious sensitivity towards people struggling with binge eating, because for alcohol and cigarettes, you can physically go without that. That is something you can avoid. Versus with food, he's like, you have to redefine this relationship with something that you must participate in, but now have to see it in a healthy manner. I'm not saying the person can't cut out these TV shows, but you could absolutely be going to friends' houses and be exposed to driving through Airdrie and seeing another house on a regular basis, where there's an element that you almost, toward just using this example, towards houses, you cannot avoid. That maybe you feel the conviction towards not watching the shows, but you still can have the conversation with your family or your spouse, what our dream house could look like, or whatever in those regards. That this one I find is a little bit more of that in between. I'm not sure how you would be able to cut it out entirely. So how do you deal with the heart issue so you can be exposed either just by driving through a nice hit neighborhood, or to be able to sit down and watch a TV show with your wife, husband, whatever, significant other in this context, and have dealt with the heart issue.
Absolutely. You can't, unless you're going to go live in the woods. You can't escape that. But I think there's a big difference between I have to drive somewhere and I turn on a TV show and watch purposely the inside of a house, right? It's one thing to drive by a house. It's another thing to take a tour of that house. And I'm not saying this person has to do that. I think we do have to recognize, all of us, that there are things that we need to go, should this be off limits for me? Is this thing ultimately something that's good for my soul and that I can keep in right relationship with, or that I need to shut off either permanently or for a good length of time until I can maintain that relationship? I do think oftentimes we use the freedom, the fact that I'm free, not only, as Canadian citizens, and if anybody listens to this who's beyond Canada, then, you'd have to
define your freedom.
Define that in your own context, but I don't know that anybody does. But we're also free in Christ. And, growing up in a church, it was like, I liked this idea of being free in Christ. When I got old enough to start to understand this, and then I had to come to the place where I realized in my freedom, there are some things that I am choosing to just put myself in bondage to, because I am incapable at this point in my life to have a relationship with this thing that is healthy. And so the first one that comes to mind for me is music. I had severe guardrails around anything I listened to for probably 20 years. Because I couldn't get into music without going to the kind of music I like, which is very dark, heavy metal. And I just recognized if I'm going to take one step into this pool, it's going to be 3 days at most till I'm in the deep end of this pool, and I'm listening to a bunch of stuff that ultimately the fruit of it in my life is not something I want. And so I'm not advocating for any sort of rule that we have to have.
Yeah.
I think that we just need to recognize, like when you think of the words of Jesus, what is good does it do to gain the whole world and lose your soul?
Yep.
Like, we're selling our soul so often for far less than the whole world.
Totally.
And if the whole world is not a good deal,
That's a good one,
why
Doug.
are we selling our soul for a fraction of
Yep.
it?
Totally.
Yeah.
So,
We last night's soul care session, he used the phrase, it was last week. We need to deal severely with sin before sin deals severely with us.
It's good.
And just the thought that, like, the enemy is an enemy. Like, he's not letting his foot off the gas, or he will always kick you when you're down. Like, so if you're not in the business of dealing severely with your own sin, you're in trouble, right?
Yep.
So same thing to this person. Like, we could foo-foo this question or innocently go, you're just watching a host show. Like, how bad can that be? If it's killing your soul, that's bad.
yeah.
Right? So
Yeah.
And I would like to just say, when you talk about the enemy, we're not just talking about Satan. We're also talking about the beast that crouches at the door in every one of our lives,
Totally, yeah.
which is our own sinful nature,
Yeah.
our own flesh.
Yeah.
I have spent over the last year a lot of time just reflecting on that Cain and Abel story. There's this beast that's crouching at your door, but you must master it.
Amen.
And God's not saying that like a rule, like, you better master it. God's like saying this as a father speaking to his son, as the creator speaking to his creation and speaking to all of his creation through that story.
Yeah.
That there is this beast that is not your friend, that is a part of you.
Yeah.
And too often we treat that beast like it's our friend
Yeah.
instead of recognizing that beast doesn't care about me at all.
Yeah.
It wants what it wants, and it will sacrifice everything and anything to get it.
Yeah.
And it is me.
yeah.
Yeah.
Very true.
So, yeah.
Yeah.
Good stuff in that question.
Wow, we've gone on a really deep thing about this question, and I really appreciate this question. So,
Yep.
I love when these questions come in and they intersect with the reality of someone's life.
Yep.
Like this. This is great.
Very much so.
So if we didn't answer your question, you can feel free to reach out to one of us personally as well, and we can talk about it some more.
Yeah.
Just to help you process that. We appreciate that, but yeah, as you're working this out, I mean, clearly there's something stirring in your heart around this whole area, and so if you want someone to talk to about that, you can
Yeah.
reach out to us.
Cool. Blake, I'll let you resume your hosting duties.
All right. I'm looking for the questions.
There you
I
are.
skipped to the top of the page, which that is a long page.
It is a long page. This is question 452.
Yeah, I was gonna say, we're at question 452, so yeah, that's a long page.
Question says, how should I treat and honor others biblically, friends or my wife?
I'm wondering if they're like, should I treat friends should I honor friends or my wife? Because I'm not doing both. I'm just kidding.
Probably asking if there's a differentiation.
I know. I'm not saying that's what they're asking. It just struck me as funny. Who should I honor? I'm only doing one.
I only have so much honor to give.
So, I started the last question. Do you want to start this one?
Sure. I think Jesus gives us a really both simple and lifelong, difficult, complex answer. Love. And that is what he calls us to, loving others. And that is going to come by a self-defined self-emptyingness towards us. And so towards our friends, we are going to have to pay attention to their lives and care for them in a self-sacrificial way. One of my goals for this year, my New Year's resolution, if you will, and look at this, it's almost end of February, I'm still working on it and conscious of it. I beat the stats.
You're way ahead of stats. Yeah, that's awesome.
My goal this year, which is funny, came out of two things. One, realizing even some of the conversation we had today, I can get so busy with my day-to-day, I forget to look up and see others' lives. And two, I was listening to a podcast about men in particular. I said, men have a really hard time identifying with anything other than their jobs. For instance, women can not not love their job, but be like, I'm a really good friend. Like, no guy has ever described himself as, tell me about yourself, I'm a really good friend. They're like, that was really convicting for me. I'm like, I would like to be a good friend. So I've been working on that this year, which means I have to pay attention. I'm writing down significant dates in friends' lives to be able to follow up with them. I'm using the pre-scheduled thing in my phone because I know I will forget. Like, so-and-so has that coming up on that day. Right. Pre-scheduled text to follow up. How did that thing go? You will have to make your life less about you, to be self-sacrificial towards having friends in many different ways. And I think the best way to do that is to ask Jesus for eyes to see them as he sees them. And all of a sudden, the burden of that and the task of that becomes easier because you see them as an image bearer. And then all those get in some ways amplified the closer that relationship comes. And so I will extend that beyond friends, your coworkers. You have a different obligation, I think, towards them than the stranger on the street because you're regularly interacting with them. You may not call them friends, you may call them friends, but you are regularly interacting with that person in your sphere, so you continue to draw that closer and closer. So I think the most intimate circle is going to be your significant other and your kids, where they are going to get the most of you, where your life should be, in a lot of ways, more considerate about them than it is even about yourself. Only able to say that because that is supposed to flow both directions. So when you are giving of yourself for somebody else within that circle, your significant other, not your kids, they should be, in the biblical model of marriage and relationships, reciprocating the same. And so as you have two people caring for one another, I think that creates this beautiful flow of being able to honor one another the way the Bible intends. I think, especially in our day, I hear regularly, language for people of how would you speak to or care for your friend often is easier to do that than how we like to care for ourselves. I think we're able to put ourselves down, be hard on ourselves, or at least that's my default. So if I ask, how would I treat somebody else in my scenario, a close friend, it's often easier to do that. So then this just alivens that process to care for your wife in this person's and my own context, and then hopefully they're doing the same. So love, and that's defined by self-sacrifice, and then trusting the Spirit to carry you through doing that.
Go ahead.
I was going to say, much along your lines, different words maybe, but I have thought about this the last couple of years, especially with my wife, but it's gone way beyond that, is this idea of praying blessing for people. It started with enemies because Jesus says we should pray for our enemies. and I was like, oh, that's an interesting thing. So, can I pray for blessing for those that, I think are an enemy? But then more so, can I pray for blessing of people in my life? Mm-hmm. It puts me in a place when I do that of like actually considering people. Not a flippant prayer, like I pray for Doug and Kyle, they have a good day today. It's like, no, I pray that for Doug and Kyle that they would be blessed. And then thinking, how would they be blessed today? Do I know that? Am I thinking about you guys? Am I conscious about the people in my life? And then, interestingly, our family this week started talking about love languages at a family meal. And it was, again, me being conscious of, if you want to honor people and you want to love people well, you need to know their love language. Yeah. Because if you don't speak their love language, this happens often in marriages. Yep. You have a spouse that's like, I don't feel loved at all. And the other one's like, what are you talking about? I love you all the time. It's because you're not speaking that language, right? Yeah. So do you actually, whoever's writing this question or whoever's considering it, do you actually know your friends, your wife, well enough to know what their love language is, right? Like, for me, I'm a physical person. You give me a hug, I'm going to feel loved. Yep. You walk by me and be like, Blake, awesome job. I'm like, thanks. Like, that's not going to mean a whole lot to me, right? So, I know that people care and they're trying, but it just, if I want to love people well, I'm going to have to know what that is. Yep. So,
in the Bible Project series on the Sermon on the Mount. Yep. And I can't remember which episode, so listen to the whole thing because it's really good.
Awesome.
There's one episode where they talk about righteousness, and it's not Tim and John, and there's a new host that's in, I can't remember her name, but she's talking to a scholar, and they're talking about the word righteousness, and they're talking about the idea of being righteous, and it's such a profound conversation they have. and I believe it's the Hebrew word tzedakah that they get into that then goes into the Greek word that I can't remember. And the one thing they say is we miss that word in both the Hebrew and the Greek is always defined in terms of relationship with others. When we read the word righteousness or righteous now, we think of it in the context of me doing the right thing personally.
Holiness.
We don't think of it in the context of my relationship with other people. And I so appreciated that. And so what I found so liberating in that conversation was they go into exactly what you said, Kyle, that the standard is different of what is righteousness based on the relationship. Right? So I think oftentimes, and I'm not disagreeing with what you say, Kyle, we are called to selfless love in every capacity, in every relationship. Like that's supposed to be the foundation of our life. That can, if we don't understand the concept of righteousness, turn into either, well, now I'm neglecting those closest to me and who rely on me the most to meet the needs of strangers.
I've got a note I just wrote down before I forget to talk more about that. So continue.
Or on the flip side, I say, and I'm going to pick on you, but not because of personal, just for an illustration. Kyle's like this very needy person who's always asking more of me, more and more of me, and I'm in the place where I'm like, well, I have to love him, and so it becomes where I lose my freedom in Christ because I feel this sense of obligation to love. And so we got to learn to walk the balance of all of this wisdom of life in Christ. And oftentimes we only picture one side of that or talk about one side of that, which prevents people from living in the freedom they have in Christ, because we can't truly love if we're not living in freedom. If I'm doing something for you, Kyle, out of obligation because you're this person who's constantly asking me for more, and I think about the movie What About Bob? I don't know if you've seen that movie.
No.
But Kyle,
that's pretty old for Kyle.
I know. But it's a classic. It's, you know, Kyle, come on, man. Come on.
What about Bob?
It's a psychiatrist who goes on vacation, and this one very needy patient follows him and just keeps interacting with him, and like it's a good movie.
It gets crazy.
It gets insane. Yeah, it's really really funny. And he's at his wit's end. And I think Christians sometimes end up in that same place because we don't understand this concept of righteousness in the context of relationships, in the context of I get to, on the basis of what this relationship is, there's a right response. And it's always love, but I'm allowed then to put a boundary in place for the sake of the other relationships that matter as well. Now, we can go too far that other way and be like, I'm just going to love my wife and kids and devote myself to them, and then everybody else who needs me too bad. Then we're not living righteously towards them.
Totally.
In the same way that in the name of the stranger, we cannot live righteously towards our spouse and our family. And so it's this balancing act that we are called to walk through the leading of the Holy Spirit and the wisdom of Christ, that we remain in this place of freedom to be able to righteously love every person we interact with. I loved your communion thought on Sunday, where you talked about the podcast you're listening to between a Catholic and a Protestant, and the Catholic was like, you know, Jesus didn't leave us a book. And when I read this question, and I'm not picking on the person who asked the question, I think a lot of times we do. We try to look for the answer in the Bible instead of allowing the Bible to point us to the wisdom of Christ and the leading of the Spirit to where the answer is found. And so you can find lots of verses in the Bible to justify all sorts of things that are against the way of Jesus. But I think this idea of righteousness in the context of relationships matters so much. And so in every situation that I'm in, what is the righteous way to love you that also allows me to maintain righteousness in all of the other relationships of love that I'm called to have?
No, I really appreciate you getting onto that track of reprioritizing, because that's been abused in many different ways, even in like individual circles where for the sake of others, like it's classic one within ministry.
Absolutely.
I'm going to sacrifice my wife and family for the sake of, or my husband and family for the sake of ministering to my church because that's who God needs. while neglecting them. This has actually also been politically misused recently. I don't know if you guys have kept up with it. J.D. Vance has used this as a Christian way of thinking of we take care of our family and then we take care of our thing. So speaking around immigration laws, where we're to care for these certain spheres. It's a thing that gets attributed all the way back to Aquinas in some parts and then Augustine in others. Wow. This idea of prioritization of love. And when we turn it off as this channel of it only pours out from one to the next and the most inner one is the most important, really what it leaves is the trickle of remaining love to every subsequent one. Mm-hmm. So in the idea politically it goes then, we've got nothing left by the time we care for our nation, expanding out to that level, that, no, we can't take in immigrants or refugees. Mm. Versus it's actually supposed to be the opposite of caring for these to be able to expand from one out to the other, knowing that as everybody else interacts with those, we all end up getting cared for in the right way. So a simple conversation for our family, we could tend to just be like, especially with the way our family operates, busy lives, we're going to just covet all the time that we have for us to just be for us. Mm-hmm. Whereas we've had conversations with the kids of we're going to bring friends in who don't have the same stability in their circles and their families into our time that could be just ours, to have them around our supper table to help influence them and care for them. And then that expands out everywhere. The blessing that we have in Canada, in America, for that context for J.D. Vance, that blessing is supposed to be used to be able to welcome in and expand those circles more and more. Yep. So just wanted to talk about how that was not a priority sequence. I would avoid that language as much as just a repeated habitual sequence. I'm going to see my wife more than anybody else. Likely. So I'm going to and because the definition of our relationship, need to prioritize it, but that does not mean it has to become so centric. All the gravity pulls in towards that relationship. It's supposed to be something that flows in and out to multiple spheres.
Yeah. Yep. Well, when I say prioritize, I don't mean start here if there's anything left.
Yep.
I mean, how do I live in such a way that every relationship I have is righteous?
Yeah. And I wasn't condemning you at all. I just wanted to, because of that, and that politicization came back to me, realizing that's a conversation happening right now, wanted to address that. Yeah.
But I do think we oftentimes, we don't think about righteousness in the context of every one of our relationships.
Not at all.
Yeah. And so I've actually been pondering this a lot, thinking about, the Bible makes it clear God is righteous.
Yep.
God is righteous in his context of his relationship with all of us.
Yeah. Yep.
And then that caused me going, okay, how do I view God? Do I view God as righteous in his relationship with me? Right? Do I trust that in all things, whether I sense it or not, that God is dealing righteously with me? It's been a profound thought that I've been mulling over in my head quite a bit.
Yep.
And I think if we, the other thing I would say with regards to this, how do we treat and honor others? I've also been reflecting a lot, about Jesus, whatever you do for others in my name. And just those last three words, in my name.
Yeah.
That we have to remember that our love for all people is ultimately first and foremost in the name of Jesus, and all that means. That means I do it from that place of freedom. That means I do it as one who's secure in my belovedness as a child of God. So I'm not doing it to get someone to like me. I'm not doing it to get God to like me. But from this place of understanding who I am, I serve, and ultimately then it becomes irrelevant how they respond to it if I'm doing it in Christ's name. There's a lot of layers meditation on that I think we could engage in on those three words, right? That if I'm doing it for his sake and in his name, that means it doesn't matter how that person reacts. I could do the right thing and they could, bite my head off. Irrelevant. I still have pleased Jesus if I've loved that person well and righteously in his name.
Awesome part.
I like that a lot. All right, next question.
This isn't even a question. This is a statement.
I feel like
it's an incomplete statement. I
feel like the previous question and this question are actually came in together, and they're kind of or if they didn't come in together, it's from the same person, just kind of
on the same
all
trajectory
along
of thought.
The same kind of idea.
It's just funny because separately, as we have them on our list, there's not even a question mark to end it. But
it's not even actually a sentence.
No,
it's incomplete. But it could be. Define this. Maybe that's what they're asking us to do is define.
And I'm not picking on this person's grammar.
It's just funny how.
Please don't be offended.
I'm teasing. It says biblical, platonic boundaries within relationships with the other sex. Maybe it's a category on like Jeopardy.
Well, that's where I think it is linked to the previous one.
I can't even see when they came in, but while you guys begin conversation.
So,
It's an interesting question though, because there's lots of debate around that for sure.
Sure.
So let's go.
Absolutely. Again, I would say our standard is not the Bible. Our standard is Jesus. And so we need to approach all of these things with the wisdom and the love and the righteousness of Jesus in every one of these relationships, which should be a selfless, sacrificial love that treats this person rightly in the context of that relationship with them. And that it should be a selfless thing. And I think this is hard because it deals with the heart. But so much of our faith actually is a heart issue, and we want to make it, here are your 6 rules, but I can abide by those 6 rules and my heart be completely wrong.
Yep.
And so it does ultimately become a matter of the heart. But having said all that, maybe I'll contradict myself. If you are a married person, I think there's a different set of standards than if you are an unmarried person, in the sense that I think if you are a married person, I'm going to borrow some language from Shrek. The ogres are like onions because there's layers.
Yeah.
I think in our relationships, if we're married, there should be spheres of relationship, and the closest one should be our spouse. And then from there will be other circles with all sorts of people of the other sex. And no one should have a closer spot than our spouse.
Right.
I agree with that.
I don't feel like if you're not married, obviously that's an irrelevant topic. If you are a single person, I think you need to treat every person lovingly and honor them and recognize them as an image bearer of God and treat them accordingly.
Yeah.
But I think if you're married, and again, this goes back to that idea of righteousness. I think you're getting into trouble if you start conveying to somebody of the other sex things that you haven't talked to your spouse about.
Yep.
I think you're wandering into dangerous territory where you are starting to develop a closeness in that relationship that you're not fostering in your marriage. And so your relationship with your spouse needs to be first, and I think by a long shot, because you want to just protect the sanctity of that relationship. Yeah. And then from there, you gotta remember that people are image bearers of God and they are worthy of our love. And as I touched on in my sermon last week, none of them should be a means to our end.
Yep. Because it's all of our context being married. I know that's an easy way to start, but I just want to imagine, even as we have the conversation, for somebody who is single, what do they set up as the boundaries in those friendships?
Well, and that's right. I think if you're single, I think it is a boundary of selfless love and recognizing the other person as an image bearer of God. And I think there's honesty there. And I think if you're single and they're single, and there is and this is where it gets into the context of a relationship, and you're like, I want things to remain platonic.
Yeah.
And they seem to have some interest in me, then the righteous thing to do is to have an honest conversation with that person and let them know that that's not going to happen.
Yeah.
Right? So I think how that works out can be very... it will vary in every relationship. That is very hard to give some specific rules.
Right. So if this is a young guy sending in the question, there would be no difference in the boundaries you set up for a young guy hanging out with a girl his age and a guy his age. I'm just asking the question as you're phrasing it.
If it's platonic, I think there's a difference between.
I'm just curious. Yeah,
I think if it's a platonic relationship, I don't know that. And again, I think there is that idea of recognizing them as an image bearer of God and treating them with respect and honor and righteously. Yeah. From a foundation of selfless love. Yeah. I think that's a pretty good guide for those. And
I'm not disagreeing. I'm just trying to think contextually. I'll have people over to the house while Allie's out working oftentimes, either in groups to play games, but there's definitely also been a lot of nights where I'll have a guy friend over. Now I am married, but I have lots of female friends. I would not invite a female over after my kids have gone to bed while my wife's out and we stay and talk till 11:30, 12 o'clock when Allie is on her way home, as I do with some guys, that I'm going, I have a lot of really good friends with women, but there would be boundaries I wouldn't have there. And I don't know if I would even encourage anybody younger for, and maybe this is just me defaulting into my kind of evangelical purity culture mind. I think there are massive abuses and harms that have come from playing that to extremes, like the Billy Graham rule type ideas. Though I know for him, that probably came out of real purity and it's been expanded and applied onto everybody in malforms.
For the sake of context, can you give people the Billy Graham rule?
Billy Graham rule is, as far as I could simply articulate it, do not ever spend time with the opposite sex without other people present.
Other than your wife.
Other than your wife.
Or children.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Which has led to much harm, especially within work environments where females won't get promoted and have the same kind of time with their direct report because that's a barrier at camp. But totally cool for a male manager to take out his employee to lunch, but can't even drive to lunch with his female direct report kind of thing. So to not play like any extremes is wise in my mind. There's many Friday mornings. Keelan and I are here, the only ones here in the office. Like, I know context where the pastor would be like, well, I can't go in because Keelan's the only one here. Not going to do that. But those boundaries are going to ebb and flow with, as we've already been talking about with the friendship and other relationships, there's a navigation of wisdom there. That again, I don't think we could ever cover all the specifics, but there are certain boundaries I would apply in the context in which I will spend time with somebody of the opposite sex who is entirely platonic, based on the fact that I'm trying to honor, for my context, my wife in that relationship, that I will have different boundaries with a male friend.
Yes, but that because you're married.
Yeah, but again, because we can play this question both ways, we don't know who wrote it. I still have boundaries with a platonic friend as a female, as a married man, that I don't know how far I would make adjustments for a non-married person. That I'm going, again, there may be some ebb and flow based on the person's marital status, but not entirely either.
Yeah, I would say as a parent, like, I would not encourage, and we've even had rules, and I'd say I still have that rule. I do not let my kids have opposite gendered friends in our house alone.
Right.
We've just always had that rule. Like, that's just not cool, I guess, in my thinking.
Yeah.
There's lots of debate around this one. I've had it with many people. I didn't grow up with a lot of female friends at all. Like, I just, for whatever reason, hang out with males all the time. But I know other people who've had, like, cross-gendered relationships and even like close, like say would be their best friend.
Right.
And I remember hearing that in a youth group somewhere that, you know, you cannot be best friends with the opposite sex. Like, that's just an impossibility because one of them will always want more than that. Right.
Yep.
And people who do have that relationship get really upset at that because they're like, no, we can. Right.
You just don't understand.
And then I do have one friend that was in that kind of relationship. It was like, no, you think you're in a relationship where you both think the same way, but if you gave the opportunity to date, it would be all in, right?
Right.
Yeah.
So I don't know if it matters, but
yeah, it's really tough. Like, I regularly go for coffees and have even had a number of lunches with people within our congregation that are female, and I sit and have that. I know other contexts that would not be an okay thing.
But that's a different relationship than this question's asking.
Sure.
Right? Pastor to congregant relationship is not friend to friend.
Sure.
And that's where I think, and I agree with you, Blake. I think oftentimes where there is this platonic relationship, I'm not going to say always,
Yep.
I think oftentimes where there's this platonic relationship, there is, I have seen far more often than not,
where there's an attraction.
there on at least one person's part.
Yes.
Right.
And the other person may be
feels-
oblivious to it,
totally.
or maybe just living in self-denial to it.
Right.
I don't know.
Right.
Or maybe they're aware of it and they don't care. And that's where I get into the whole issue of you're not honoring that person.
Sure.
If you know that there is some interest there,
Yep.
You should be honest.
you need to you need to maybe withdraw, because you can't be like, Hey, I'm not interested in you. Okay, but let's still hang out 4 nights a week. Right? Because you're not being fair to that person in that setting. And so, yeah, I think that I maybe this sounds really like old fashioned. I think that there's not a lot of truly platonic relationships that exist across the sexes.
And I would quantify that with like intimate or like deep.
Sorry, yes, deep.
Yeah.
Deep. I just think that most of the time, and I'm not saying never, but I think most of the time, you grew up, and you said you grew up, and all your good friends were guys. That was my same experience, and I think that's the most common experience, especially once you hit puberty. Maybe before puberty, it's less so.
Yeah.
But once you hit puberty, it does seem to shift that there's just this connection that on a strictly platonic level. And when I've seen those deep relationships form, most of the time, one person is hoping for more.
Now, we don't have a female voice, and Keelan's giving me the eyes over here. I wish she had a mic right now. Because I think of my daughter, and I do think it's different for females. Like, I think there's more females that I grew up with, that I know, that, even looking at my daughter and her friends, that hang out with more males than they do girlfriends. I think that's more of a norm than the guys hanging out with girls, maybe. And she would be like, I'm not interested in any of them. But again, I'm like, why do you think Billy is inviting you to his house? Like, it's not because he wants to play basketball with you, right? Like, but I don't know.
And I'm not saying never, but I do think more often than not.
I think with that caveat, I'd be with you, just understanding the male brain. But I also think there's certain things that have been shifted as a result of our exposure within church. Like I look outside of the church walls and my connections and friendships there, where that seems to be much more natural, and see seemingly quite close relationships across those lines.
That you have?
Not that I have, but I observe regularly, and go, I wonder if there's just something that has been formed as a result, or barriers that are held. I would entirely say there have been times in my life where I would not have been able to, as we've been articulating, have a close friendship with a female, because I wouldn't have been able to navigate the intimacy of a close friendship apart from feelings towards that person of a sexual nature, especially in my young teenage years. I would not have been able to navigate that. And I got married so young, I don't know when that would have stopped, because I just never pursued them. But I just wonder, especially now, even in a context within a Christian circle, where more and more people are getting married later on in life, what does it look like to be in your late 20s, 30s, have been working alongside people really closely on serious projects, spend a lot of time with them outside of that, again, maybe in a context, I have not been used to it, and so we contextually can't, both in our own experience and in the Christian cultures we've grown up in. But I think of young guys in our church who in their late 20s, early 30s, have been working alongside females in close, intimate settings for a long time and don't have any struggle with that barrier. I wonder if things have also changed and we just can't speak to that.
I wonder, and I wish there wasn't, because I'm sure there's great cross-gendered relationships out there. I believe that. I believe it to be true. But we have massive stereotypes when it comes to opposite sexes. I just, as you guys were speaking, for some reason I thought of the TV show Friends. I think most people have seen Friends. Great group of friends, right? Different gender, but we were cheering for them as the audience to hook up with each other or make relationships, and they all did, right? Like, they all had their little times if you watched the show through all the years. So I just think it's funny that we put that expectation out there, that we're like, it couldn't be a TV show about 5 friends without them being attracted to each other, right? Or cheering for them, or hoping that they would be, right? Couldn't we have a TV show where we just enjoy that they all have relationships? I don't know.
I think though that's the nature of entertainment, right? Like, the romance love story is one of the main themes that
wins
is
viewers.
a plot, and it's always in almost every setting. The only show I can think of where they didn't do that was Seinfeld,
right?
Because that that
they'd already.
sexual tension you create in the show is part of what just brings the audience back.
But Jerry and Elaine had already dated.
They had, but then there's never any, like between the four of them, there's never any will they, won't they, that I can remember in that show at all. They're literally presented as four friends who get together and have coffee, and it is strictly platonic.
Yeah.
I can't think of another show where that even happens.
Yeah, that's for sure. But then I think, okay, so if it's not TV show, I walk into Starbucks today and I see a couple sitting at a table. What's my assumption?
I've tried to play that game with myself. It depends on what they're wearing is where I can break it down to. If you can tell they're both dressed for like business, I assume it's a work meeting. If you are there in casual, and I've actually even looked. Sometimes you'll see like their work badge to get them to wherever, whatever. You'll see their credentials, or one of them has a ThinkPad, which is the clear sign you're using some company's laptop, right? So it depends on the context. On what they're wearing is often how I've broken it down. Because if I see two people in business attire, I will assume they're
What if they're not?
Then I'll assume they're probably romantically involved.
So you're not ever considering platonic.
That's not where my brain goes. Yeah. I would not be surprised if they told me otherwise after, especially because you'll observe a lot, especially if I sit in coffee shops regularly and work, you won't see any physical engagement over the 20 minutes. Then I go, okay, that's platonic. But my first assumption to see male and female is.
But I would bet that a lot of us, and maybe I'm just saying me, Blake. Maybe I'll leave everybody else out. Blake in that same situation. If there was some think bubble that I could see above their head, the one guy's like, it's platonic, and the girl's like, I really like him. I would start cheering. Right. Like I'd be like, I hope that she wins him over or whatever. Right?
Really? Yeah.
And that's what I think. And I will stand by my conviction that more often than not, one of those two people is hoping for something more. I'm not saying it can't be, but I'm saying more often than not, there is some underlying desire that's not been expressed, but is secretly being hoped for.
I wonder if we get some AER, because I am with you, fully in your camp, and yet I know that there'd be someone shouting at us right now. That is not true. I have a great relationship with...
And that's great. And I'm not saying it can't happen. I'm saying more often than not. And I would also say, just because you have a relationship with that person that's strictly platonic and you're good with it, does not mean that they are.
Baby.
I still caveat it of be aware of this at all times, because I think anything could direct itself that way over time. Be aware of the potential of that, versus I think if you just say, well, don't have the friendship because they all end up that way, or almost all of them end up that way, it's going to put real barriers.
I never said don't have that friendship.
No, fair. I'm just the assumption that most of them end up that way could point somebody to say, well, then don't even bother, and then perpetuate all those ideas of breaking and keeping distance between those people, versus even part of my frustration with taking over men's ministry here is I just want our guys in our church to be around more females in our church, because generally within church spheres, women are working a lot harder at their faith than men are. And I'm not pointing about anybody in particular here, but I go, what our guys in our church need, and this is part of why I started book club too, was so you can hear the thoughts that our women are having, which are going to way help you guys. That just perpetuating those lines, one, has a lot for both sides to learn of, and two, I think really damaging, perpetuates those same troubles. When I spent most of my time in just male spheres and could not have a female relationship, when I was exposed to females, I wouldn't have the tools to keep any of those barriers and to honor the platonic nature of that relationship. Versus the more time I have had good female friends, my mind is far less likely to go to means of lust or wanting to objectify somebody, because I'm much more able to work with that set of tools. And so if we say there's a risk of any one of these friendships across gender lines to become something, it actually, I think, is making the problem worse, not better.
I don't know that I agree with that, but okay.
I was going to say I do, but I need to jump in because we're out of time today.
We are.
So if you have more on this question, please send in your AER. It's obviously a good one.
We might be sending in our own AER.
We got some debate on this one. It's too bad we're going to turn off the mics, because I just I got more to say. So. But thank you for tuning in to this episode of Inverted Orthodoxy podcast. Check us out on invertedorthodoxy.com. Send in your questions. Give us a rate and a review, like all that good stuff. We will see you next week.